island beauty with everything going for her.
She was a runner-up in Miss Bahamas competition.
She just has the look and the personality.
He was the old flame she followed to America.
He missed her, she missed him.
They reunited and picked up right where they left off.
But after 4 blissful weeks, it all goes wrong.
He dropped off at the airport to go back home.
All of a sudden, she just falls off the face of the earth.
She never got on the plane.
Family and friends are frantic to find the missing woman.
They were concerned, very concerned.
Mom flooded her phone until the voicemails backed up.
She's afraid her daughter's been kidnapped.
But the truth is far worse.
She got caught up with very evil people.
What they did really struck a nerve with me.
There's some level of jealousy, hatred, vindictiveness. It's evil.
The horror that she endured was unimaginable.
February 28, 2006. It's a quiet evening in Cocoa, Florida, a small coastal town just 45 minutes from Orlando.
Cocoa is a small town of about 16,000 people, directly west of Cocoa Beach. Pretty heavy tourist area.
It's a working class town, home to the folks who staff the attractions and hotels.
But at 12:30 a.m., residents in the Pine Acres neighborhood are about to be awakened by a violent scene.
People heard multiple gunshots and immediately calls to 911 began pouring in.
When detectives arrive, they see a man lying on the ground covered in blood.
Is that who I think it is?
They're able to quickly ID the man, who was well known to police as a drug dealer named Willie Parker.
When we arrived, Willie Parker was dead next to his vehicle in the front yard of a house.
He was on the ground with the door open, blood all over the place.
There were drugs in his vehicle. He had several prior arrests for drug sales.
However, detectives suspect the murder was more personal than a robbery or drug hit.
They didn't take his money, they didn't take his watch, they didn't take nothing. So we know it wasn't a robbery.
What detectives don't know is that what starts as an investigation into a murdered drug dealer will soon turn into a search for a missing young woman from the Bahamas, and a shocking crime that will take them 4 years to solve.
Never in a million years would detectives have predicted these 2 cases were connected.
It's one of the most bizarre twists that you can imagine.
She was loved, and she didn't deserve this. She did not deserve this situation.
22-year-old Bahamas native Doris Knowles was as dazzling as the crystal blue water and brilliant white beaches of the islands she called home.
Her beauty is kind of breathtaking. Everyone who sees it, oh my God, who is that?
She competed in beauty pageants and was actually the runner-up in the Miss Bahamas Universe pageant in 2004.
She could do anything. She had the brains, she had the look, she had the personality, she had everything. She kind of a firecracker.
Doris had put her award-winning personality to work at the Bahamas Ministry of Tourism.
She worked for the Bahama Host Program, which trained hospitality workers in customer service skills, sort of making sure that they represented the island right.
That suit her personality, just being smart and bubbly.
However, she had bigger dreams.
She was in college. She was very focused.
She was considering medical school.
She was really smart, so she's like the top in class. She had a bright future.
By the fall of 2004, Doris thought she'd found someone to share her future with too, in fellow islander, 27-year-old Christopher Pratt.
He was educated in the Bahamas. Their families knew each other.
Christopher was about 5 years older when he and Doris met. She was drawn to his maturity. Christopher was almost like a protector, a little bit more experienced.
However, in November of 2005, this young couple's love would be put on hold.
I want us to stay like this forever.
I know, me too, babe.
Christopher Pratt had found some financial opportunities in Florida that he couldn't pass up. So now he had to break the news to Doris that he was leaving the Bahamas for Florida.
Everyone growing up in the Bahamas looking for a way out in terms of trying to make it, you know?
He had a cousin here, and they were doing like a construction business.
I don't want you to go.
I know, but I have to.
Christopher promised that the separation would only be temporary.
Let me go over, get things going. When I get settled, you come over.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Over the next several months, the couple maintained a long-distance relationship.
They were in contact with each other while he was in the U.S., and he kept asking her to move over here to be with him.
So he offered to buy her a plane ticket to bring her to Cocoa so they could be together. He really missed her. He really wanted to be with her.
She missed him just as much as he missed her and agreed to come over.
On February 15th, 2006, after several months apart, Doris and Christopher were reunited, if only for a few weeks.
It was intent just to spend time with him, see if it's even going to be something that she would want to stay here long term.
Christopher and Doris picked up right where they left off, and for the next 4 weeks, their romance was as strong as ever.
Once they got back together, it was almost like no time had passed at all. That connection between Christopher and Doris was very deep.
If anything, the distance between the two of them made their passion stronger.
When the time came for Doris to return to the Bahamas, Christopher continued to try to convince her that her place was with him.
You know I want you to stay, right?
I'll come back. Maybe for good.
Doris wanted to be with him, but making the move to Florida wasn't as easy as Christopher hoped.
Doris explained she couldn't leave her family like that. She was very close with her parents, so it was a big decision.
She was a good person. She loved her mom, and she was always keeping in touch with her.
My mom spoke with her daughter frequently, like a couple times a week.
But now, on March 21st, 4 days after Doris was due to arrive back in the Bahamas, her mother can't reach her.
She's not answering her phone.
She called her daughter repeatedly.
Doris had given her mom Christopher's number in case she couldn't get a hold of her.
Come on.
Yeah, hello?
Christopher,
Hey, Miss Noakes.
is Doris there?
Nah, what you mean?
She's not answering the phone.
Wait, she ain't call you when she landed?
No.
That's impossible. I dropped off at the airport myself.
What?
Christopher's news makes Doris's mother even more concerned than she was before.
That left her worried. This was completely unlike Doris.
They knew that something had happened.
When the Cocoa police get involved, all signs point to a disturbing possibility.
Her passport activity was non-existent.
She never got on a plane.
Beginning of March 2006, 22-year-old Doris Knowles was having the time of her life in Florida.
She'd come over from the Bahamas in February to rekindle things with her old flame, Christopher Pratt.
He cared for her, he loved her, he wanted her to move to Florida to be with him.
But by March 21st, it's been 4 days since Doris has had contact with her family, and her mother is worried sick.
Doris was known to keep in touch with her family, her mom in particular. Every day she would call her.
And when Doris's mom reaches out to Christopher, he says that he dropped her off at the airport.
Yo, she ain't call you when she landed?
No.
He thought she had gone home to see her family.
In a panic, Doris's mom contacts her daughter's friends in the Bahamas to see if anyone has spoken to or seen Doris.
Pick up the phone.
She also contacts police in Doris's last known location, Cocoa, Florida.
I'd like to file a missing persons report.
Mrs. Knowles is transferred to a detective with the Cocoa Police Department.
Caravano, Cocoa Police.
I spoke with Mrs. Knowles. She said that it was unusual for her not to, call and say, hey, Mom, I'm okay. So that raised flags with us also at that point.
My boyfriend took her to the airport.
Yes. She was supposed to be home days ago, but I haven't heard from her.
You have the hope that something hasn't happened? and she's just somewhere else. But I think they knew in the back of her mind something has happened.
It's not like her to disappear like this.
Okay, ma'am, we're gonna do all we can to help find your daughter. I'll be in touch.
Thank you.
After talking to Doris's mom, the Cocoa police begin their investigation.
We was reaching out with customs, the airport police, to try to find out if she did cross back.
So when we checked with customs immigration, there's no passport activity.
Which means Doris never got on the plane.
So now detectives start to wonder if she made it to the airport at all.
Detectives decide it's time they talk to Christopher Pratt.
He was staying at one of the local motels here in Cocoa.
Christopher Pratt? Yeah.
We need to ask you a few questions about Doris Knowles.
Did y'all find her?
He seemed genuinely concerned about Doris and wanted to know if she was okay.
He was forthcoming and wanted to cooperate with us.
However, Christopher has no new information for detectives.
Christopher Pratt told us that he took her to the airport to fly her back to the Bahamas and has not seen her since.
Did you make sure she got on the plane?
No, man, I just dropped her off.
Can you think of anywhere else she might have gone?
No.
At this point in the investigation, detectives have little reason to doubt Christopher's story.
He cared for her, enough to ask her to move from the Bahamas to leave her family and to move over here to be with him.
It's all my fault, man.
Why do you say that?
Because I should have never asked her to come.
He's very quiet, soft-spoken. He doesn't seem like the person that would be aggressive.
We'll let you know if we hear anything.
When detectives return to the station and run Christopher's name through their database, the results appear to confirm their first impression of Doris's boyfriend.
She didn't have a criminal background at all.
No speeding tickets, nothing.
But when the detectives run Doris's name, something does pop up.
There was a disturbance at a bar downtown in Cocoa, and one of our officers had responded.
She was given a citation.
It's a trespass warning, dated March 15th, 2 days before Doris's family lost contact with her.
Detectives figure that that can't be a coincidence.
So we looked into that call, who the officer was that handled the call.
The officer's name is Thomas Shaw, and detectives waste no time bringing him in to talk.
You want to see me?
Yeah, come in, have a seat. Doris Knowles, you wrote up for trespassing a few days ago.
Yeah, I remember her.
According to Shaw, it was a routine incident.
She's this gorgeous girl. Guys are hovering, buying her drinks.
She had a little bit too much to drink. It was getting a little loud.
The bartender ended up asking her to leave.
An argument ensues and things get out of hand.
Once police were called, Officer Shaw responded to the scene.
He states that he gave her a trespass warning and asked her to leave.
Did she comply?
Yeah, I mean, she did it without any trouble. And that's it. Not exactly.
What the officer tells them next adds a new twist to Doris's disappearance.
He did meet with Doris Knowles off duty, and then he hooks up with her. They have a sexual encounter.
Detectives start to wonder if Christopher knew about this.
Could this be a case of jealousy or a hookup gone terribly wrong?
There's some level of jealousy, hatred, vindictiveness. He's watching his girlfriend with another man.
Cocoa detectives investigating the disappearance of Doris Knowles have just discovered that the 22-year-old Bahamian had an encounter with police 2 days before she disappeared.
In fact, Doris partied so hard that the bartender didn't only cut her off, he also ended up calling the cops.
Cocoa patrolman Thomas Shaw was the responding officer.
He talked with her and they calmed the situation down there. He put her in his patrol car.
Though Shaw admits, things then took a somewhat unprofessional turn.
The officer began talking to Doris, and of course, she was a very beautiful girl. Gorgeous.
According to Officer Shaw, that was his last call for the night. So after driving Doris to the motel where she stayed with Christopher Pratt, they talked for hours and then exchanged phone numbers.
We pressed that issue a little bit more, and Officer Shaw said that he gave his number to her to contact him if she was interested in meeting, having dinner, hanging out.
And the following evening, the off-duty officer picked up Doris for a date, not knowing she was involved with Christopher Pratt.
All of a sudden, detectives learned that Doris and Christopher may have been on the outs.
Shaw says that when he picked up Doris, a man followed her out of the motel room and talked to her in the parking lot.
Shaw says he doesn't know who the guy was, but his description matches Christopher Pratt.
According to Shaw, it looked like they were having an argument.
What was that about?
Nothing.
All right, where to?
How about your place?
That's cool.
Shaw says Doris ended up spending the night.
He hooks up with her. They have a sexual encounter.
They want to know exactly what his relationship was with her. They ask all sorts of questions.
You never saw her again?
I tried calling her, but she never answered my call or called me back.
Officer Shaw insisted that it was a one-time thing.
Like, y'all ought to be out there talking to the guy that she was staying with.
Her boyfriend.
If you want to call it that. She told me they haven't been getting along.
Detectives begin to suspect that Christopher Pratt had kept this information from them.
They were currently dating and still living together, and she's now with another man. I would definitely speculate that there's some level of jealousy.
And if Christopher knew that she spent the night with this man, could that have sent his jealousy to the next level?
Detectives need to have another talk with Christopher. But when they return to the motel, they discover that he's checked out of his room.
It had been cleaned and turned over.
Detectives put out a bolo for Christopher Pratt and continue to search for Doris.
We're just waiting to see what other type of leads we can get.
Weeks pass with no new leads. But on April 12, 2006, Cocoa detectives get a call from South Carolina State Police.
Really?
The trooper informs Cocoa detectives about 3 arrests he'd made the night before.
Can I see your license registration, please?
A South Carolina state trooper was acting on a tip about drugs coming through the state.
There were 3 men in the car. 27-year-old Batiste Kirkman, the driver, 31-year-old David Willis, and 27-year-old Christopher Pratt.
Where y'all headed to?
New York. See some friends.
New York, huh?
Yeah.
Made y'all step out of the vehicle.
Police had a tip about this particular vehicle transporting drugs.
It didn't take long for the tip to pay off.
When they searched their car, they found drugs, and they found a firearm.
They collect the firearm and send it off to be tested.
Police took the 3 men into custody, unaware of the Florida bolo for Christopher regarding Doris's disappearance. But David Willis claims to have information that would blow the case wide open.
David Willis starts swearing up and down that he didn't have any involvement with him. He didn't know the stuff was in the car with them.
I was just driving the car.
Them being in this vehicle in South Carolina, they were going to charge them federally.
He was telling the authorities there in South Carolina that he needs to talk to the police back in Cocoa.
David Willis says to the officers, "Let me tell you what I know."
He says that he has some information about a murder.
Hurry up, let's go!
April 12, 2006. It's been more than 3 weeks since 22-year-old Doris Knowles disappeared in Cocoa, Florida. But detectives working the case are about to make an unexpected breakthrough.
Caravano, Cocoa Police.
I got a call that there were 3 Cocoa boys arrested in South Carolina.
They're 27-year-old Batiste Kirkman, 31-year-old David Willis, and 27-year-old Christopher Pratt, Doris's boyfriend.
Batiste, Christopher, and David were actually traveling to New York when they were stopped in South Carolina.
They were going to New York to flip some drugs. They had cocaine, marijuana, an abundance of it on them.
While detectives are surprised to learn Christopher is involved in a drug deal, it's the intel offered by David Willis that catches their attention.
Once he was arrested, David Willis tells deputies in South Carolina he has information about a murder.
At that time, we drove to South Carolina.
In South Carolina, detectives find Willis, eager to talk.
The drug charges and the firearm charges, he could have been looking at 10, 15 years, and he was trying to mitigate that.
But when detectives sit down with David Willis, they are surprised about whose murder he wants to discuss.
They thought this would be a big revelation about what happened to Doris, but it's not.
Guy named Willie Parker.
Detectives know exactly who David Willis is talking about.
It's a drug dealer. He was shot and killed in Cocoa.
The murder had occurred on February 28, 2006, 3 weeks before Doris's disappearance.
Okay, what can you tell us about the Parker murder?
Batiste killed him.
Batiste Kirkman was well known to police.
According to Willis, Batiste had a vendetta against Parker for moving in on his girlfriend.
Batiste killed him.
Yeah. And you looked him in the eyes, no conscience. It's crazy.
He said he was psychopathic. He would just kill people. Everybody feared Batiste.
Willis claims that on that night in February, Batiste staked out Willie Parker's home, waiting for him to come out.
Willie Parker was standing outside. They drove up. Kirkman got out, shot him multiple times.
Hey, yo, Willie!
Willis claims Batiste was the shooter. But another man was driving.
The getaway driver in the shooting of Willie Parker was Christopher Pratt.
No, man, let's go, man. Hurry up, man.
But how does Christopher's involvement in Willie Parker's murder connect to Doris's disappearance?
Was Doris Knowles caught up in any of this?
Doris?
Pratt's girlfriend.
Yeah, I know who she is.
Where is she?
She's dead.
What Willis tells them next is beyond belief.
What happened to Doris Knowles?
I don't know, but I know they buried her.
How do you know that?
I took Batiste to get the shovel.
Willis tells detectives that Batiste called him for a ride on the afternoon of March 17th.
Yo, Batiste!
That is the same day that Doris is supposed to fly home to the Bahamas.
I need you to give us a ride.
All right.
Willis says he knew better than to ask Batiste Kirkman too many questions.
And dude is crazy. Chris and Doris was acting real strange, so I knew something was up.
How were they acting?
Scared.
Next, Willis says he drove to a nearby home improvement store where Batiste went inside, leaving him to wait with Doris and Christopher in the car.
He says that Batiste bought a shovel, duct tape, and several bags of ready-mix concrete.
David said after their trip to the store, Batiste dropped him back home and asked to borrow his car.
After that day, he never saw Doris again.
And he killed that girl.
Any idea why?
Nah. But I heard Batiste talking about where they left her.
He was claiming that she was buried somewhere near the power lines on State Road 524 in Cocoa.
After talking to Willis, detectives bring Batiste Kirkman into the interrogation room.
He had been suspect in several violent crimes.
Batiste was very used to being interrogated by detectives, and they could tell.
As we sat down with him, he was very curious. He asked questions, which is not unusual for a suspect in a crime. They want to know where you stand and what do you have.
Word on the street says you killed Willie Parker.
Never. Not Willie. Willie was a good friend of mine.
He wouldn't give us any information.
Getting nowhere on the Parker murder, detectives turned their focus to Doris.
Yeah, I hear Doris Knowles is a good friend of yours too, isn't she?
You can say that. It's Chris's girl.
When's the last time you saw her?
Been a couple weeks. Last I heard, she was in the Bahamas.
He says that she went back home. He was pretty calm and cool about it.
I hope nothing happened to her.
Detectives have just learned the fate of 22-year-old Doris Knowles from a man named David Willis.
David Willis was claiming that she was dead and that Autise Kirkman and Christopher Pratt buried her.
After Autise Kirkman's coy interview goes nowhere, detectives turn their focus to Doris's boyfriend, Christopher Pratt.
Looks like you're getting yourself in some pretty serious trouble.
We beat around the bush a little bit. We told him, maybe if you have any information that'll help you.
What can you tell us about Willie Parker?
I heard he got shot, that's all.
We tried to soften him up a little bit, but he wasn't buying it.
Detectives try to catch Christopher off guard when they change the subject to Doris's disappearance.
What you doing up here in South Carolina? Your girl's been missing for over a few weeks down in Florida.
Look, I took her to the airport, all right? Look, man, when a guy like Autise asks you to go on a ride to New York, you don't say no.
Christopher says she was supposed to be going to the Bahamas. That's all I know.
The conversation was very, very frustrating.
Christopher refuses to reveal what happened to Doris, but the trip to South Carolina does give detectives plenty to go on.
So they have all of these claims from David Willis about these two being involved in Doris's disappearance.
Once back in Florida, detectives begin building a case against Christopher Pratt and Autise Kirkman in the murder of Willie Parker and the disappearance of Doris Knowles.
We didn't have a lot of good evidence in the Doris Knowles case yet, so we were still trying to piece that together.
After contacting authorities in the Bahamas, they discover that Christopher Pratt's record isn't as clean as they thought.
He did have a history in the Bahamas that was mainly in drug sales.
Detectives know Christopher was involved in both the Parker murder and Doris's disappearance, but can't shake the feeling that it wasn't his plan.
You could tell, though, he was just like going along with Kirkman.
Next, detectives follow up at the home improvement store, where Autise supposedly purchased a shovel, duct tape, and concrete.
We knew the date that happened, so we just went through thousands of receipts and finally found the receipt that only had concrete, a shovel, and duct tape.
The purchaser paid cash, so the receipt alone wasn't enough to confirm David Willis's story.
However, a timestamp on the receipt and the store's security footage provide detectives with the proof they need.
We watched Autise check out at the counter, and we watched him push the cart out of the door with concrete, a shovel, and duct tape.
So Willie's story checks out, but they still don't know why they would kill Doris and what, if anything, that has to do with Willie Parker.
Police had thought maybe there was a jealousy angle when Doris hooked up with a cop. But now it seems like something totally different.
With Willis, Kirkman, and Christopher Pratt in custody in South Carolina on drug and weapons charges, detectives focus their efforts on finding Doris's body.
David Willis told us that Autise Kirkman and Christopher Pratt buried her on State Road 524, so we literally got everybody we could and went out there.
We had a front end loader, we had the ground penetrating radar, we had the cadaver dog out there.
We dug multiple different locations. We dug hole after hole after hole. We didn't find anything, we didn't see anything.
With frustration mounting, detectives question whether or not David Willis was being truthful about the location of Doris's body.
She could be anywhere.
Without a body, detectives know it'll be hard to convict the men of murder. But they decide it's time to tell Doris's family what they've learned.
That's not a conversation we want to have over the telephone. We did emphasize that we think we know what's happened. We would like you to come over.
Doris's mother and father fly to Florida to meet with the detectives in Cocoa.
They're there with us. We're kind of outlining what we know, that we do believe that they killed her.
The mom was very shocked about Chris's involvement in it. I assured them that we were going to do what we can to try to find their daughter.
Doris's mother offers to assist detectives.
She requests to talk to Christopher Pratt, who's still being held on drug and gun charges from the traffic stop.
Detectives work with the prosecutors to set up a meeting in South Carolina.
She pled for him to give her any information he could to let her know what happened to her child.
Chris sticks to his story, saying the last time he saw Doris was when he dropped her off at the airport.
Just tell me where she is so we can bring her home.
Wish I could help you, but I can't.
Please.
He denied everything, but he cried. It was starting to get to him now.
However, once detectives receive the ballistics report on the gun seized in the traffic stop, they finally have the evidence they need to charge the men with at least one murder.
It was the firearm that was used in the murder of Willie Parker.
In October 2006, Vatisse Kirkman and Christopher Pratt are charged with first-degree murder in the death of Willie Parker and are extradited to Florida.
David Willis identified Kirkman as a shooter and Christopher Pratt as a getaway driver.
Yo, man, let's go, man. Hurry up, man.
It takes 4 years, but Vatisse Kirkman finally goes on trial first in July 2010.
Vatisse Kirkman was found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison.
With Vatisse Kirkman convicted of one murder, Christopher Pratt sees the writing on the wall.
If he goes to trial, he could be found guilty and he's going to get life in prison.
It's a risk Christopher isn't willing to take, so he has his attorney reach out to the prosecutors.
Christopher is looking to a plea deal.
The prosecutors are willing, but only if Christopher helps them first.
He would also testify in the Doris Knowles case, and we would have to locate her body.
When you're young and you're in love, you tend to put the blinders on. You don't see things quite as clearly, and you just press on with what you want to do. This is a 22-year-old who was in college, a 22-year-old who had a mother who was concerned about her, who had a father who was concerned, who got into a bad situation, who thought she loved someone, who thought she could trust this man for whatever reason. So it was not just about finding a body, it's about finding a person who was killed.
4 years after she vanished from Cocoa, Florida, detectives believe they're on the verge of learning what happened to 22-year-old Doris Knowles. Prosecutors have offered Doris's boyfriend, Christopher Pratt, a plea deal to avoid a life sentence for the murder of Willie Parker.
He'll only make the plea deal if he tells them the truth about Doris's disappearance.
In August of 2010, Christopher takes the deal.
Me and a couple of prosecutors interviewed him at the courthouse.
We're here really just to talk about Doris Knowles.
Christopher tells detectives it all started when he saw Doris leaving with Officer Shaw.
Shortly before Doris had disappeared, she had hooked up with a Cocoa police officer.
So you see her talking with a police officer, and what happened as a result of that?
Christopher explains that Doris did have a wild side. He couldn't control her, so he didn't try, even though it bothered him.
However, according to Christopher, it wasn't jealousy that drove what happened next.
Instead, he says it was Vatisse Kirkman.
Where your girl at now?
Man, she on a date with some cop.
You sure he's a cop?
Yeah, he been in the neighborhood all the time.
She can tell him about Willie.
Christopher claims he never told Doris anything about the Parker murder or about Vatisse. But just seeing Doris talk to a police officer was enough for Vatisse.
No, she got to go.
Vatisse told him that we had to get rid of Doris because she was friends with the cop.
Christopher says he tried to talk Vatisse out of it, but says he had no choice. It was either Doris or both of them.
I already know take my ticket below.
Christopher says that when Shaw dropped Doris off at their motel the next day, he already had her suitcase packed and waiting.
He told her that his friends were picking them up and they would take her to the airport.
Chris, what's going on?
It's gonna be okay.
Christopher Pratt said that she trusted him, and he took advantage of that.
Instead of the airport, David Willis drove them all to the home improvement store where Batiste was caught on surveillance.
And I'm dumbfounded by that. You're just gonna sit there and look at the girlfriend knowing what you're about to go do?
Batiste comes back out, puts the shovel, duct tape, and the bags of concrete in the trunk, and then they head back out to David Willis's house.
Chris, I'm scared.
Once they dropped off David at home, under the cover of darkness, Christopher says that Batiste demanded he tape Doris's hands and feet together.
Tape her hands.
No! Chris, no! Chris, please, no! Why? Chris, please, please don't open me!
Then Batiste drove the car to the outskirts of town.
They stop along a wooded area off of 524 in Cocoa.
Dig.
Once again, Christopher says he'd had no choice.
That's why you put him in the car.
Christopher says he dug a hole deep enough to hold a body.
What now, man?
So good to put in a hole.
Then, Christopher says he took Doris from the back of the car and carried her to the hole.
Then they got water from a nearby pond to mix with the cement.
And I said, did Batiste Kirkman kill her before putting her in the hole?
She go buried alive.
I said, well, how do you know she was still alive? And he said, she was looking at me. I can't even imagine the amount of fear in her mind.
Chris says that he covered her face first so he wouldn't have to see her.
After telling his story, Christopher takes detectives out to where they buried Doris.
Gotta be somewhere in this area. I think full perimeter for 10 to 15 feet around here. Somewhere around here.
He didn't act very emotional. It was, I think it's somewhere in here. And that was it. We took him back to jail.
"4 years after their initial search, police finally locate the body of Doris Knowles.
We finally recovered her.
Her remains are sent to her family in the Bahamas. And authorities are finally able to charge Batiste Kirkman and Christopher Pratt with Doris's murder.
Once again, Christopher Pratt cut a plea deal with prosecutors.
When Batiste Kirkman goes on trial in April of 2016, Christopher Pratt is the star witness against him.
On the stand, Christopher basically repeats the detailed account of the murder that he gave to police.
In the end, the jurors see Batiste Kirkman as a cold-blooded killer.
The jury found him guilty of capital first-degree murder.
Thanks to his plea deals, Christopher Pratt will eventually be released.
10 years on the Willie Parker case and 10 years in prison on the Doris Knowles case combined to give him 20 years. And then he would be deported to the Bahamas.
Please, no!
To the investigators who worked the case for over 4 years, it's too little for what Christopher Pratt did to Doris Knowles.
My personal belief is that he just wanted to be seen as a victim, and I was just here because Batiste Kirkman made me be here. But I think in reality, he was upset because she cheated on him, and he knew exactly what he was doing.
The city of New York never sleeps, but it often forgets. Buried beneath the frantic pulse of the neon lights and the relentless roar of the subway, the ghosts of the past wait in the shadows of forgotten alleyways and precinct filing cabinets. It was 1989, A year that would become synonymous with a silence so profound it still echoes in the ears of those who remember the chilling discovery on the Upper West Side. A young woman, vibrant and full of unspent promise, vanished into the thin, biting air of a November night, leaving behind nothing but a half-finished book and a front door locked from the inside. The mystery was a jagged tear in the fabric of the community, a sudden, violent rupture that defied the logical order of a city accustomed to chaos. Police arrived, their flashlights cutting through the gloom of an apartment that felt like a stage set for a nightmare that had yet to reach its climax. There were no signs of a struggle, no shattered glass, no frantic pleas for help. Just an absence, an empty space where a life had been, an enigma that would haunt the detectives on the beat for 3 agonizing decades. The community recoiled, the veneer of safety shredded by the realization that someone, or something, had walked through their walls and taken one of their own without leaving a whisper of an explanation. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the initial, fevered search for answers bled into a long, drawn-out purgatory of dead-end leads and silent phones. The lead investigator, a man whose resolve was forged in the unforgiving crucible of the NYPD, spent years staring at the same crime scene photographs, the faces of the victim frozen in time, her gaze an eternal, silent question. The mystery was not just a file, it was an infection, a slow-acting poison that seeped into the lives of everyone who touched it. Parents clutched their children tighter, neighbors turned inward, and the city, in its infinite indifference, moved on, leaving the case to gather the dust of obsolescence. But in the quiet, dark corners of the precinct, the investigation never truly ended. It lived in the margins of notebooks, in the whispered theories of rookies, and in the stubborn refusal of the truth to remain buried forever. The suspect list had always been thin, a collection of vague shadows and half-truths that led nowhere, a carousel of disappointment that kept spinning while the real monster walked free in the labyrinth of the city. Then came the breakthrough, a piece of forensic evidence unearthed from a box that had been sealed for nearly 30 years, a microscopic, silent witness that finally spoke. It was the moment the earth shifted, the instant that the long, cold winter of the case began to thaw. The identification was a lightning strike in a dark room, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the department and brought the ghost of 1989 back to the surface, with the force of a tidal wave. The suspect, a man now aged and weathered, was living a life that appeared to be the antithesis of the violence he had hidden away, a man who had walked among them, a neighbor, a friend, a face in the crowd, all while harboring the memory of the night the silence began. The arrest was not a grand display of tactical prowess. It was a quiet, crushing realization that the past is never truly dead. It is merely waiting for the right moment to emerge. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the sound resonated like the closing of a tomb door that had been left open for too long. The community, once paralyzed by the terror of the unknown, suddenly found themselves confronted with the faces of the monster they had feared and the reality of the tragedy they had tried so hard to bury. The cold case had been shattered, broken into 1,000 pieces that were now being reassembled into a narrative of loss, pursuit, and the inevitable, relentless march of justice. It was a story of a city that never forgets, even when it pretends to, and of the individuals who refuse to stop looking, who refuse to let the darkness win, who walk the long, lonely road of the search because they know that somewhere, at the end of that road, there is a truth that demands to be heard. The investigation was not just about the capture of a man. It was about the exorcism of a ghost that had haunted a generation, the final, difficult step in a journey that had lasted for a lifetime, a journey toward the only thing that could ever truly heal the wound, the absolute, undeniable light of the truth. The air inside the precinct basement always smelled of old paper and ozone, a stagnant atmosphere that felt entirely disconnected from the roaring traffic of Manhattan above. For years, the box labeled with the case number of that 1989 night sat on the bottom shelf of Section 4, an archive of failure that every detective who walked the halls knew by heart, but rarely spoke of aloud. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, The investigative machine had operated at a fever pitch, dragging the local rivers, tossing abandoned buildings, and intercepting transient men at the Port Authority bus terminal. Yet, every grid search yielded the same maddening result: absolute nothingness. It was as if the victim had stepped off a cliff into an alternate dimension, leaving her keys, her winter coat, and a freshly poured cup of tea on the kitchen counter. The tea had gone cold, the mold had taken the mug, and the detectives had been left with a jigsaw puzzle, missing half its pieces. The initial canvass of the neighborhood had turned up dozens of potential witnesses, but their testimonies were a chaotic jumble of contradictions. A bodega owner swore he saw her walking north toward 86th Street with a tall man in a dark overcoat. A delivery driver insisted he heard a muffled argument near the service entrance of her building at midnight. A neighbor down the hall claimed she saw a stranger lingering by the mailboxes 2 days prior. Each lead was a thread that the detectives pulled with frantic desperation, only to watch the fabric unravel into nothing. The technology of the late 80s was a primitive shield against such a calculated disappearance. Fingerprints were lifted from the apartment, but in a pre-automated era, matching them against physical cards in a federal archive was a slow, agonizing crawl that took months, only to return hits on local utility workers, the landlord, and friends who had solid, unbreakable alibis. The primary investigator, Detective Marcus Vance, became a fixture of the Upper West Side, his trench coat a familiar sight as he walked the block, staring up at the windows of the apartment building, trying to force the brick and mortar to give up their secrets. He knew the building's layout better than his own home. He knew the blind spots of the courtyard, the rattling mechanism of the freight elevator, and the specific way the streetlights cast long, predatory shadows across the asphalt after midnight. Vance was convinced the killer was someone who understood the architecture of the block, someone who could move through the hallways without drawing a second glance from the hypervigilant New Yorkers who inhabited the complex. But suspicion is not evidence, and without a body, a weapon, or a clear motive, the district attorney's office refused to authorize wiretaps or search warrants for the handful of peripheral figures Vance kept returning to. As the first anniversary of the disappearance arrived, the media attention began to evaporate, swallowed by the rising tide of the city's crack epidemic and the skyrocketing homicide rates that pushed older, unsolved cases to the back of the line. The front-page headlines that had once screamed of the Upper West Side mystery were replaced by newer, fresher horrors, leaving the victim's family to wage a lonely, desperate war against the creeping forgetfulness of the public. They held press conferences that no one attended, pinned missing person flyers to telephone poles that were scraped clean by city sanitation workers 48 hours later, and sat by a telephone that refused to ring. The silence was a physical weight, and invisible walls that grew thicker with each passing season, isolating the family in a perpetual state of grief that had no legal definition and no emotional resolution. Inside the precinct, the case file grew into a monstrous, multi-volume testament to dead ends. Vance refused to let the file be moved to the long-term warehouse in Queens, keeping it stacked on the corner of his desk like a physical manifestation of his own shortcomings. He checked the newly established missing persons databases every Monday morning. He cross-referenced unidentified remains found along the eastern seaboard. He interviewed prison inmates who claimed to have information about the case in exchange for reduced sentences, only to find they were trading in jailhouse rumors and fabrication. The frustration was a slow, toxic leak that eroded Vance's personal life, his marriage fracturing under the weight of his obsession with a ghost, his mind constantly rewinding the tape of November 1989, searching for the one detail he must have overlooked. By the mid-90s, the neighborhood itself began to gentrify, the gritty, bohemian edge of the Upper West Side giving way to high-end boutiques, luxury condominiums, and a new generation of residents who had no idea that a horrific mystery had occurred in the brownstone they now paid millions to inhabit. The original witnesses moved away, some died, and others suffered the natural erosion of memory that accompanies the passage of decades. The delivery driver who thought he heard an argument was killed in an unrelated robbery in Queens. The bodega owner retired to Florida, his recollection of the night turning into a vague, unhelpful blur of shapes and colors. The investigation was dying a slow, natural death, its heartbeat fading to a faint, erratic flutter that only Vance seemed capable of hearing. Then came the turn of the century, and with it, the introduction of CompStat and a computerized approach to policing that prioritized active, solvable crimes over the lingering phantoms of the past. Vance was pressured to clear his desk, to focus on the immediate violence spilling onto the streets, to stop wasting city resources on a file that was older than some of the rookies entering the academy. He resisted, fighting bureaucratic battles with captains who saw him as a relic, a stubborn dinosaur who couldn't let go of a case that had long since been written off as unsolvable. When Vance finally took his forced retirement in 2005, he didn't leave the case behind. He carried a photocopied duplicate of the entire file in the trunk of his car, a heavy, cardboard box filled with the remnants of a young woman's life and a detective's shattered career. The case was officially classified as a cold case, a bureaucratic euphemism for a file that was dead in the water, requiring a miracle to ever see the light of day again. It was assigned to the newly formed Cold Case Squad, a small unit of detectives buried in the underbelly of Manhattan South, tasked with reviewing thousands of unsolved homicides with limited resources and minimal institutional support. The file was picked up, turned over, and set back down by a succession of detectives who looked at the lack of physical evidence and sighed, knowing their time was better spent on cases where clothing, bloodstains, or weapon fragments offered a tangible starting point for modern forensic testing. The 1989 file had none of that. The apartment had been cleaned and rented out within 6 months of the disappearance, the original crime scene obliterated by coats of fresh paint, new flooring, and the footsteps of tenants who knew nothing of the tragedy that had preceded them. Yet, the silence that enveloped the case was not permanent. It was a holding pattern, an intermission in a drama that was waiting for the world to invent the tools necessary for its own resolution. In the background of the city's chaotic expansion, the science of DNA profiling was quietly evolving from a clumsy, experimental technique into a digital scalpel capable of extracting identifying information from samples that were previously considered completely useless. The tiny flakes of skin, the degraded hair follicles, the microscopic biological traces that had been collected from the victim's apartment and preserved in small, paper envelopes were sitting in the evidence vaults, their molecular structures intact, holding the identity of the killer like an encrypted code that was finally about to be cracked by the technology of a new era. The breakthrough began not with a dramatic confession or a surprise witness, but with a routine audit of old evidence boxes initiated by a young detective named Sarah Lynn, who had joined the Cold Case Squad with a background in molecular biology and an impatience for old-school policing methods. Lynn didn't look at the case files through the lens of intuition or street smarts. She looked at them as data problems waiting for a computational solution. When she opened the 1989 box, she didn't see a tragic story about a missing woman. She saw a collection of preserved biological samples that had never been subjected to high-sensitivity short tandem repeat (STR) analysis or mitochondrial DNA sequencing. She saw an opportunity to test the limits of modern forensics against the stubborn opacity of the past. Lynn submitted the envelopes to the State Forensic Lab, bypassing the standard backlog by utilizing a new grant designed specifically for testing pre-1990 sexual assault and homicide evidence. The process was painstaking, requiring the technicians to carefully extract the degraded DNA from samples that had been exposed to the fluctuations of temperature and humidity in old storage facilities for over 30 years. Weeks stretched into months, and Lynn received the same cynical looks from the older detectives that Vance had received decades earlier, the institutional consensus being that she was chasing a ghost that had long since dissolved into the atmosphere of the city. But Lynn persisted, her conviction anchored in the absolute, unyielding reality of genetic material, a material that doesn't lie, doesn't forget, and doesn't fade with the changing politics of the police department. The report from the lab arrived on a rainy afternoon in late winter, a document that would instantly shatter the stagnation that had defined the case for 37 years. The technicians hadn't just found DNA. They had managed to construct a complete, high-resolution profile of an unknown male contributor from a microscopic trace found on the victim's fingernail clippings, a detail the original forensic team had collected but had been unable to analyze in 1989. The profile was clean, distinct, and completely unmatched in any existing law enforcement database, meaning the killer had managed to avoid entering the system for his entire adult life. He was a phantom with a genetic signature, a monster whose digital avatar was now uploaded into the federal CODIS system, waiting for a match that would pull him out of the shadows of the city and into the harsh glare of justice. The revelation was a jolt of electricity through the precinct, a sudden, violent awakening for an investigation that had been comatose for a generation. The name of the victim was pulled back into the active ledger, the old notebooks were reopened, and Detective Lynn found herself staring at the same photographs that had consumed Marcus Vance's life. She realized she was standing on the shoulders of giants, using the meticulous, ground-level police work of the past to guide the high-tech weaponry of the present. The hunt was no longer a blind search through a city of 8 million people. It was a targeted, scientific pursuit of a specific genetic code, an operation that would eventually lead the team to a quiet, tree-lined street in Brooklyn where the prime suspect had spent the last 30 years building a perfect, normal life on a foundation of absolute horror. The digital fingerprint left by the state laboratory was a spark dropped into a valley of dry timber. Within hours of the CODIS upload, the machinery of the New York Police Department shifted from a low-frequency hum into a high-voltage roar. The match wasn't a direct hit on a convicted felon. The database did not hold a mugshot or a state prison number that corresponded to the genetic profile recovered from the victim's fingernails. Instead, the break came through the nascent, razor-sharp methodology of investigative genetic genealogy. The unknown profile was run through public and private ancestral databases, mapping the intricate, interconnected root system of an extended family tree that spanned the outer boroughs of New York and reached back across the Atlantic. Detective Sarah Lynn spent 3 days locked in a windowless room with a team of forensic genealogists, their monitors displaying massive, sprawling diagrams that looked like the blueprints for a complex railway network. They weren't looking for a criminal. They were looking for a lineage, tracing the genetic markers back through generations of immigrants, marriages, births, and deaths, filtering out the noise until the vast web began to narrow toward a single, specific branch. The data was cold, mathematical, and completely indifferent to the passage of time. It bypassed the lies told to investigators in 1989, the false alibis typed on manual typewriters, and the changing architecture of the Upper West Side. It focused on the blood, on the inherited mutations that a killer had carried into that apartment 37 years ago and left behind in his desperate struggle to erase his own presence. The genealogical trail eventually converged on a family name that had remained entirely absent from the original multi-volume case file, the Moretti lineage, a working-class family that had populated the brownstones of South Brooklyn since the middle of the 20th century. From that family tree, the analysts isolated 3 brothers who would have been in their 20s and living in the metropolitan area at the tail end of the 80s. 2 of the brothers had passed away in the early 2000s, one in a construction accident on the Williamsburg Bridge, the other from a terminal illness in a veterans hospital. That left one surviving sibling, a man named Vincent Moretti, whose current address was listed as a modest, well-kept single-family home on a quiet, tree-lined street in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Lynn stared at the driver's license photo that popped up on her screen. Vincent Moretti was 61 years old, his hair a thick mane of silver, his face lined with the comfortable creases of a man who spent his weekends tending to a backyard garden and hosting neighborhood barbecues. According to public records, he was a retired superintendent for a commercial real estate firm, a man who had spent decades managing the maintenance crews for the very buildings that line the avenues of Manhattan. He had no criminal record, save for a handful of moving violations from the 90s and a minor zoning dispute over a property boundary in 2012. To the world, he was a pillar of his community, a quiet, dependable family man who had survived the turbulent decades of New York's history without ever drawing the attention of the law. But as Lynn cross-referenced Moretti's employment history from 1989, the blood in her veins turned to ice. In November of that year, Vincent Moretti hadn't been living in Brooklyn. He had been employed as the live-in assistant superintendent for an upscale residential building on West 84th Street, exactly 3 doors down from the brownstone where the victim had vanished into the autumn fog. He possessed the keys, the access, the knowledge of the alleyways, and the specific, architectural understanding of the neighborhood that Marcus Vance had insisted the killer must have had. The realization was a physical blow to the room. The monster hadn't fled the state or dissolved into the criminal underworld. He had simply walked down the street, changed jobs a year later, moved across the river, and allowed the city's infinite, chaotic growth to bury his tracks. The tactical response required a level of surgical precision that tested the nerves of every detective assigned to the squad. They couldn't simply roll up to the Bay Ridge home with sirens blaring and a warrant in hand. A familial DNA match from an ancestral database was an investigative lead, not probable cause for an arrest under New York state law. They needed Moretti's direct, unadulterated genetic material to close the loop, to provide the district attorney with a forensic certainty that could withstand the onslaught of a high-priced defense team in a Manhattan courtroom. A surveillance operation was initiated, a 24-hour watch that turned the quiet, suburban street in Brooklyn into a high-stakes chessboard. Unmarked surveillance vans with tinted windows parked along the curb, their occupants surviving on cold coffee and stale sandwiches as they watched the front door of the Moretti house through long-range lenses. They watched him walk his dog, an aging golden retriever. They watched him take out the recycling on Tuesday night, his movements methodical and slow. They watched him greet his grandchildren with a warmth that felt utterly grotesque to the detectives who knew what lay hidden beneath that grandfatherly exterior. The intensity of the watch was suffocating. Every movement Moretti made was catalogued. Every piece of garbage he discarded was evaluated for its potential to hold a clean sample of saliva or skin cells. But Moretti was a creature of habit and a man who had spent his life maintaining buildings. He was meticulously clean, never discarding a coffee cup in a public bin, never spitting on the sidewalk, and keeping his household waste secured behind a locked gate until the collection truck arrived. For 4 days, the cat-and-mouse game continued in the freezing February air. Lynn knew that if Moretti caught wind of the surveillance, if he noticed the same dark sedan passing his house 3 times in an hour, the decades of silence could instantly transform into a flight risk or an act of desperation. The ghost of 1989 was a survivor. He had kept his secret through the crack epidemic, the transformation of the city, the fall of the Twin Towers, and the global pandemic. He was a master of passing unnoticed, a man who had successfully worn the mask of a normal citizen for more than half his life. The pressure on the surveillance team was immense, a silent, ticking clock that grew louder with every sunrise that passed without a viable sample. The break finally came on a Friday morning at a small, family-owned Italian bakery 3 blocks from Moretti's home. The suspect walked in at his usual time, 7:15 a.m., the bell above the door jingling in the crisp morning air. He ordered an espresso and a pastry, sitting at a small corner table near the window while he read the morning paper. 2 undercover officers, a man and a woman dressed in jogging attire, entered a minute later, their conversation light and unhurried as they ordered their own coffee and took a table adjacent to Moretti. They watched him through the steam of their mugs, their hearts hammering against their ribs with a force that felt loud enough to wake the dead. Moretti finished his espresso, wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, and crumpled it into a small ball, dropping it into the white ceramic cup before standing up to leave. He gave a polite nod to the baker, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and vanished down the street toward his home. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, the female undercover officer moved with the fluid, calculated speed of a striking viper. She reached across the small space, retrieved the ceramic cup containing the crumpled napkin, and placed it inside a sterile evidence bag that her partner pulled from his jacket pocket. The entire operation took less than 3 seconds, executed with such seamless efficiency that the baker behind the counter never even looked up from his register. The evidence bag was rushed across the Brooklyn Bridge under emergency escort, arriving at the city's forensic laboratory before the noon whistle blew. The technicians stripped away the administrative red tape, placing the napkin into the extraction tubes while Lynn waited in the hallway, her fingers drumming against her thighs, her mind projecting the image of Marcus Vance sitting in his retired obscurity, waiting for a phone call that had been 37 years in the making. The laboratory was a chapel of glass and stainless steel, a place where the chaotic, emotional mess of human violence was reduced to the cold, objective reality of chemical reactions and laser scans. The analysis was a rapid turnaround procedure, a high-priority sequence that bypassed the thousands of active cases clogging the state system. As the clock crawled toward 4 p.m., the lead geneticist stepped out of the clean room, a single sheet of paper in his hand, his expression a mask of absolute solemnity. He didn't say a word. He simply handed the paper to Lynn. The numbers on the page were a mirror image of the profile recovered from the Upper West Side apartment in 1989. The probability of the sample belonging to anyone other than Vincent Moretti was calculated as 1 in several hundred trillion, a mathematical impossibility that shattered the last remaining wall of defense the killer possessed. The phantom had a name, the genetic code had a face, and the cold case that had defined a generation of New York detectives was finally, undeniably, broken. The confirmation from the state laboratory acted as the pulling of a pin from a grenade. The administrative inertia that usually slowed the wheels of justice vanished overnight, replaced by a cold, calculating urgency that gripped the upper echelons of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the NYPD command structure. By Friday evening, a secret, high-priority briefing was convened in the Special Victims Bureau conference room, where the walls were covered not in digital projections, but in the original, yellowed photographs of the 1989 apartment. The juxtaposition was jarring. Modern forensic reports containing high-resolution DNA sequences sat atop typed police reports from an era when the department still relied on carbon paper and analog dispatch lines. Detective Sarah Lynn stood at the head of the table, her voice level but carrying a sharp, rhythmic edge that commanded the absolute attention of the 10 tactical officers and 3 assistant district attorneys gathered in the room. They weren't just planning an arrest. They were choreographing the final act of a multi-generational drama. Vincent Moretti was no longer an abstract suspect on a whiteboard. He was a living anomaly, a man who had successfully evaded the most sophisticated dragnet of the late 20th century by simply becoming baseline normal. Lynn emphasized that Moretti's background as a commercial real estate superintendent made him uniquely dangerous if he realized the perimeter was closing in. He knew the maintenance access tunnels, the disused boiler rooms, and the subterranean vulnerabilities of hundreds of buildings across the city. If he panicked, he could slip into the concrete belly of New York and remain hidden for months. The plan was set for Saturday morning, a tactical window chosen specifically because it was the time when Moretti's neighborhood was at its quietest and his personal routine was most predictable. They would not use a dynamic, door-breaching entry. The risk of an armed standoff in a densely populated residential block of Bay Ridge was too high, and the optics of a tactical unit swarming an elderly grandfather's home without absolute control of the environment could complicate the high-profile legal battle that was sure to follow. Instead, they would execute a containment arrest, intercepting Moretti when he stepped outside for his morning walk with his dog, stripping him of his mobility and his access to the interior of his house before he could formulate a response. The night before the operation, Lynn made a phone call that she had promised herself she would make the moment the lab results became definitive. She dialed a number that belonged to a small, single-story house in a retirement community outside of Phoenix, Arizona. When the phone rang, the voice that answered was raspy, slow, and heavy with the exhaustion of age. It was Marcus Vance. He was 81 years old now, his breathing punctuated by the faint hum of a nearby oxygen concentrator, his body failing him even as his mind remained locked in the details of November 1989. Lynn didn't engage in small talk. "Detective Vance," she said, her voice dropping into a respectful, solemn register. "We have him. The profile matches the superintendent's assistant from West 84th Street. Vincent Moretti. We move at dawn." There was a long, suffocating silence on the line, a silence so deep that Lynn initially feared the connection had dropped or that the shock had been too much for the old man's heart. But then she heard it, a long, shuddering exhale, a sound that carried the weight of 37 years of sleepless nights, broken marriages, and the toxic guilt of an unsolved tragedy. When Vance spoke again, his voice was cracking, the gruff, unyielding demeanor of the legendary NYPD detective dissolving into the raw emotion of a human being who had finally been granted a reprieve from his own failure. "Don't let him get back inside the house, kid," Vance whispered, his words halting and thick with unshed tears. "He knows how to disappear in the dark." Watch his hands. And tell the family. Tell them I never stopped looking. By 5:30 a.m. on Saturday, the staging area 2 blocks from Moretti's residence was a hive of silent, disciplined activity. 4 unmarked black SUVs stood with their engines idling, the exhaust plumes twisting in the freezing air of the Brooklyn dawn. The tactical officers wore civilian jackets over their body armor, their weapons concealed beneath their coats, their movements fluid and practiced. Lynn sat in the lead vehicle, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the digital tactical map that traced the positions of the perimeter units. The neighborhood of Bay Ridge was still asleep, the rows of brick houses dark, the streetlights casting a pale, amber glow over the frosted windshields of parked cars. It looked like any ordinary, peaceful weekend morning, an illusion of suburban tranquility that was about to be shattered by the arrival of a 40-year-old truth. At 6:45 a.m., the spotter unit positioned at the corner of Moretti's street crackled over the secure radio frequency. Target is mobile.
Front door is open.
Subject is exiting the residence with a K9. Lynn felt a surge of adrenaline hit her chest, a sharp, metallic taste filling her mouth as she threw the SUV into drive. All units move in for containment. Clear the intersection. Do not activate sirens. The vehicles moved in a synchronized formation, turning the corner onto Moretti's block with a heavy, purposeful momentum that felt entirely disconnected from the quiet rhythm of the morning. Vincent Moretti was standing near a patch of frozen grass by the curb, zipped into a heavy canvas jacket, his silver hair catching the first light of the rising sun. He was holding the leather leash of his golden retriever, his expression relaxed, a man entirely at peace with the world he had constructed around himself. He didn't look up until the 3 black SUVs accelerated down the street, their tires crunching against the ice, their trajectories converging on his position with the unmistakable precision of a law enforcement interception. Even then, his brain didn't seem to process the reality of the situation. He looked confused, his hand rising instinctively to shield his eyes from the glare of the oncoming vehicles, as if he believed they were utility workers or lost motorists. The vehicles slammed to a halt, boxing him in against a parked sedan. Before the doors had even finished swinging open, 6 tactical officers were on the pavement, their weapons drawn but kept low, their voices rising in a unified, deafening roar that tore through the morning silence. NYP, don't move. Keep your hands where we can see them. Step away from the animal. The sheer volume of the command was psychological warfare, an acoustic wall designed to paralyze Moretti's decision-making process and prevent him from reaching into his pockets or breaking toward the front steps of his home. Moretti froze, his mouth falling open, his eyes darting frantically from the badges pinned to the officers' jackets to the black muzzles of the weapons pointed at his chest. For a split second, a terrifying, fleeting moment that stretched out like an eternity, Lynn saw a change in his demeanor. The grandfatherly mask slipped, and behind it lay the cold, calculating intelligence of the predator who had navigated the alleyways of Manhattan in 1989. His weight shifted to the balls of his feet, his fingers tightening around the leather leash as if he were calculating the distance to his front door, evaluating the possibility of a desperate break for safety. "Don't do it, Vincent," Lynn said, stepping out from behind the lead vehicle, her badge held high, her voice carrying a calm, chilling authority that seemed to cut through the shouting of the tactical team. "It's over. We have the napkin from the bakery. We have the fingernails from 1989. There is nowhere left for you to run." The mention of the year 1989 was the definitive blow. It was the safe word that broke his reality, the specific verbal trigger that told him the fortress of lies he had lived in for more than half his life had been completely demolished. The energy left his body in a visible wave. His shoulders sagged, his head dropped, and the leash slipped from his fingers, the old dog whining in confusion as it sat down on the pavement. Moretti raised his hands slowly, his movements trembling, his face turning a pasty, sickly gray under the winter sun. He didn't speak a word as 2 officers stepped forward, seized his arms, and brought them behind his back, the sharp, metallic double-click of the handcuffs signaling the definitive conclusion of his 37 years of unearned freedom. Across the street, The curtains of a dozen houses began to twitch. The front door of Moretti's home flew open, and his wife stepped out onto the porch, her bathrobe clutched to her throat, her voice rising in a high-pitched, panicked scream that echoed down the block. "Vincent? What's happening? What are you doing to him?" "There's been a mistake. He hasn't done anything." The officers maintained their perimeter, their expressions stoic, their bodies blocking her view, as Moretti was guided toward the rear seat of the lead SUV. The contrast was agonizing. A family unit built on 3 decades of love and stability, completely unaware that the man who had built it was a specter of violence, a monster who had stolen another family's future before creating his own. As the SUV door slammed shut behind Moretti, Lynn stood on the sidewalk, the cold air burning her lungs, her eyes fixed on the front steps of the house. The operation had taken less than 90 seconds, a clinical, bloodless execution of justice that felt almost anticlimactic compared to the decades of suffering that had preceded it. But as she looked down at the pavement, she saw a single, crumpled paper coffee cup that Moretti had dropped when the officers moved in, a mundane remnant of a morning routine that would never happen again. The neighborhood was waking up now, the blue and red lights of the arrival units beginning to flash against the brick facades, signaling to the entire community that the quiet grandfather of Bay Ridge was gone, replaced by a ghost named Vincent Moretti, who was finally being dragged out into the light to answer for his sins. The journey across the Brooklyn Bridge was made in absolute, suffocating silence. In the rear of the lead SUV, Vincent Moretti sat squeezed between 2 burly tactical officers, his eyes fixed on his own lap, his cuffed hands twitching slightly against the rough fabric of his trousers. He looked smaller now, the formidable, imposing structure of a man who had built his life on physical labor appearing to cave inward under the immense atmospheric pressure of his new reality. Detective Sarah Lynn sat in the front passenger seat, her eyes occasionally drifting to the rearview mirror, watching the subtle, micro-expressions flickering across the suspect's face. There was no rage, no indignant protests of innocence, no frantic demands for a lawyer, just the hollow, vacant stare of a gambler who had played a high-stakes hand against the house for 37 years and had finally, irrevocably, run out of luck. Behind them, the city of New York was fully awake, the morning traffic choking the lanes of the bridge, thousands of commuters moving toward Manhattan completely oblivious to the fact that the most notorious phantom in the city's modern criminal history was currently being escorted across the river in a fleet of unmarked vehicles. The news had not yet broken. The department was maintaining an absolute media blackout until the suspect was formally processed at One Police Plaza. Lynn wanted no leaks, no early interference from defense attorneys who could try to halt the interrogation before it even began. This was a fragile, crystalline moment where the weight of the past was bearing down on Moretti with its maximum force, and she intended to exploit that psychological leverage to its absolute limit. Upon arrival at the precinct, Moretti was led through the secure basement entrance, bypassing the main muster deck, where reporters often hovered. He was guided down a labyrinth of concrete hallways, his boots squeaking against the polished linoleum, the sound a stark, clinical rhythm that echoed off the cinderblock walls. The destination was Interrogation Room B, a stark, windowless enclosure featuring a heavy steel table bolted to the floor, 3 plastic chairs, and a massive, 2-way mirror that dominated the far wall. Behind that glass, the Manhattan District Attorney and 2 senior homicide commanders were already waiting, their faces grim, notebooks open, ready to witness the confrontation that would either solidify their case or reveal the cracks in their decades-old evidence. Lynn entered the room alone, carrying only a single, thick manila folder, the original 1989 file that Marcus Vance had compiled with his own hands. She didn't sit down immediately. Instead, she walked to the far side of the table, pulled out a chair, and sat directly opposite Moretti, her demeanor a calculated mix of clinical detachment and immovable authority. She unclasped the folder, her movements slow and deliberate, allowing the sound of the paper tearing open to punctuate the silence of the room. She began sliding the contents across the metal surface, the grainy crime scene photos of the Upper West Side apartment, The typed forensic reports from a time when DNA was a theoretical science, and finally, a single, sharp portrait of the victim, her smiling face contrasting violently with the sterile, hostile environment of the interrogation room. Moretti didn't look up immediately, keeping his chin tucked toward his chest, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You know who she is, Vincent," Lynn said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant frequency that filled the small space like a physical presence. "You've known her name for 37 years. You carried her with you every time you walked into a residential building, every time you fixed a boiler, every time you went home to your wife and looked at your own children. You thought the city was big enough to hide what you did. You thought if you just stayed quiet, if you just became a good neighbor, a good father, a grandfather, that the universe would somehow forget. But the city doesn't forget. And the science doesn't lie." Moretti's jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching near his temple. He slowly raised his eyes, looking past the photographs, past the portrait of the victim, straight into Lynn's gaze. For the first time, the old man persona vanished entirely, replaced by the hardened, defensive instinct of a man who had survived on the margins of a brutal city. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered, his voice raspy and dry from the cold morning air. "I'm a retired superintendent. I live in Bay Ridge. I haven't been to the Upper West Side since the 90s. You're making a mistake. You've got the wrong guy." "We don't make mistakes with DNA, Vincent," Lynn replied instantly, leaning forward, her hands flat on the table, closing the physical distance between them until she was entirely within his personal space. "We have the fingernail clippings from November 1989. The victim fought you. She scratched your hands. She tore at your skin while you were trying to erase her existence. For 37 years, those microscopic traces of your blood, your skin, your identity were locked in a vault, waiting. Yesterday morning, you dropped a napkin into an espresso cup at a bakery in Brooklyn. The profile is a perfect match. 1 in several hundred trillion, Vincent. That's not a mistake. That's a signature." The mention of the bakery napkin was the turning point. Moretti leaned back in his chair, the breath escaping his lungs in a sharp, ragged hiss, his eyes darting to the two-way mirror as if he could see the array of law enforcement officials watching his every move from the darkness beyond. The fortress of denial he had constructed over nearly 4 decades was crumbling, the foundation undermined by a piece of garbage he had discarded without a second thought. The sheer, terrifying efficiency of modern surveillance had turned his own mundane habits into the weapon that would destroy him. Outside the interrogation room, the media embargo was beginning to fracture. Word had leaked to the police department's press corps that a massive break had occurred in an ancient cold case, and the lobby of one police plaza was rapidly filling with camera crews, satellite trucks, and investigative journalists demanding confirmation. The pressure was building on the district attorney's office to release a formal statement, but Lynn refused to allow her superiors to disrupt the rhythm of the interrogation. She knew that Moretti was on the precipice of a psychological collapse. He was torn between the desperate instinct to protect the life he had built in Brooklyn and the crushing, exhausting reality that the truth was finally out. "Think about your family, Vincent," Lynn continued, her tone shifting from aggressive confrontation to a softer, almost empathetic register that was designed to exploit his emotional vulnerabilities. "Think about your wife standing on that porch this morning. Think about your grandchildren. They don't know who you were in 1989. They think you're the man who builds birdhouses in the backyard and cooks dinner on Sundays. If you force us to take this to trial, every ugly detail of that night is going to be dragged into the public eye. The newspapers, the television crews, the internet, they are going to dissect your life, your family's life, until there is nothing left. The only choice you have left to make is how this story ends for them. Do you want them to watch you lie for the next 2 years? Or do you want to give them, and her family, the one thing that matters? The truth." Moretti clutched his hands together, the metal chain of the handcuffs rattling against the steel table. A single tear escaped his eye, tracking through the deep, weathered wrinkles of his cheek, a moment of genuine human fracture that felt entirely incongruous with the horrific nature of the crime he had committed. He looked down at the photograph of the victim, his expression shifting from defensive hostility to a profound, hollow despair. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered, his voice so quiet it was barely picked up by the audio sensors embedded in the ceiling.
It was. It was a mistake.
A stupid, terrible mistake that went out of control. Behind the glass, the district attorney took a sharp, sudden breath, his pen hovering over his notepad. The confession was beginning. It wasn't the defiant roar of an unrepentant sociopath. It was the quiet unspooling of a man who had carried a boulder on his chest for 37 years and was finally, desperately, begging to lay it down. Lynn stayed perfectly still, suppressing the explosive surge of professional triumph that threatened to break her concentration, keeping her eyes fixed on Moretti as he prepared to step out of the shadows of 1989 and into the absolute, unforgiving light of justice. The confession inside interrogation room B did not unfold with dramatic flair. It poured out like oil from a ruptured engine, thick, dark, and staining everything it touched. Vincent Moretti's voice remained a low, raspy monotone, a sound that seemed to have been scraped raw by decades of internal concealment. He kept his eyes locked onto the scarred metal table, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles turned the color of bone. He explained the logistics of a Tuesday night in late November 1989, a night when the wind off the Hudson River carried a bitter, freezing rain that kept the streets of the Upper West Side completely deserted. He had been working late in the basement of the neighboring building, fixing a faulty steam valve that had threatened to blow the radiator lines. He was 24 years old, fueled by cheap beer, a lingering sense of resentment toward the wealthy tenants who treated him like part of the building's infrastructure, and an unstable, quiet rage that had been simmering throughout the long, dark autumn. He had seen the victim multiple times, mapping her routine with the passive, predatory curiosity of a man who spent his days observing the private habits of strangers. He knew she lived alone. He knew the specific sound her boots made on the parquet floor of the lobby. He knew she usually left her kitchen light on until past midnight. That night, their paths crossed by absolute, horrific chance in the narrow, concrete alleyway that separated their buildings, a service corridor used primarily for trash removal and utility access. She had been taking out a bundle of recycling, her collar pulled up against the biting wind, completely unaware that Moretti was standing in the deep shadow of the auxiliary boiler exit. A brief exchange of words, a mundane, unremarkable greeting that shifted instantly into an unprovoked, aggressive confrontation when Moretti stepped into her path, blocking her exit toward the street. The victim had panicked, her survival instincts flaring as she realized the vulnerability of her position, and she had struck out, her fingernails tearing across Moretti's face in a desperate attempt to break his hold. She wouldn't stop screaming, Moretti whispered, a sudden shudder racking his shoulders as the memory of 1989 breached the final defenses of his consciousness. "I didn't go out there looking to kill anyone. I just wanted her to be quiet. I wanted her to stop fighting me. But the harder I held her, the louder the noise felt in my head. Everything went gray. It was like I was watching someone else do it, someone else using their hands, someone else pushing her down onto the concrete until the noise finally stopped." The room seemed to grow colder as the technical details of the violence were laid bare. Behind the two-way mirror, the senior homicide commanders sat in absolute immobility, the scratching of their pens the only sound in the dark observation deck. Moretti explained how he had panicked in the immediate aftermath, realizing the enormity of what he had done while the blue and red lights of the city cruised just a few blocks away. Using his master keys and his intimate knowledge of the residential complexes, he had moved the body through the subterranean boiler rooms, utilizing the interconnected maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the entire block, hidden arterial pathways that Marcus Vance had suspected but had never been able to prove the killer used. He had concealed her remains within a disused, bricked-off coal chute beneath a vacant storefront on 83rd Street, a building that was scheduled for structural gutting and foundation pouring the following morning. By the time Vance and his team had begun their frantic canvass of the neighborhood 72 hours later, the space had been filled with tons of wet industrial concrete, sealing the victim within a synthetic tomb that the city's frantic real estate boom would build over, pave, and forget for nearly 40 years. It was the perfect concealment and disposal method that relied entirely on the rapid, indifferent architecture of Manhattan to bury the evidence of his sin. I went back to work the next day, Moretti muttered, his face pasty and wet with sweat under the glare of the fluorescent lights. I swept the lobby. I took out the trash. I talked to the detectives when they came door to door. I looked Marcus Vance right in his eyes and told him I hadn't seen a thing. He was looking for a monster, and I was just the kid who changed the light bulbs. I knew if I could just make it through that first month, the city would do the rest of the work for me. New York doesn't look back. It just tears down the old stuff and builds something bigger on top of it. Detective Sarah Lynn didn't interrupt the flow of the narrative, keeping her expressions locked behind a mask of professional neutrality. She had seen enough confessions to know that any sudden movement, any flash of judgment or emotional reaction from the investigator could cause a suspect to clam up, to retreat back into the safety of their silence. She let him talk, let him empty the reservoir of his guilt until the timeline was seamless, the geography verified, and the structural details of the concealment matched the historical blueprints of the West Side blocks perfectly. It was a flawless, devastatingly coherent admission of guilt that left absolutely no room for alternative interpretations or legal maneuvers. By the time Moretti finished speaking, the clock on the wall read 6:30 p.m. The interrogation had lasted nearly 12 hours, a marathon of psychological pressure that had successfully dismantled a 37-year-old fortress of deception. Lynn slowly closed the manila folder, the sound of the paper clasp snapping shut acting as the definitive punctuation mark to the session. She stood up, her legs stiff from the hours of confinement, and gave a brief, subtle nod to the two-way mirror. The door to interrogation room be open immediately, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside to escort Moretti to the cell block for formal processing and booking. As Moretti was led away, his boots dragging against the linoleum, he stopped at the threshold, turning his head back to look at Lynn one final time. The defensive defiance was completely gone. He looked like a hollow shell, an old man who had finally realized that the life he had built in Brooklyn was a phantom, an illusion that had vanished the moment the handcuffs clicked. "What happens to my family now?" he asked, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic urgency. "They have to live with the truth, Vincent," Lynn said, her tone flat and uncompromising. "Just like her family had to live with your silence." Lynn walked out of the interrogation block and into the main muster room of One Police Plaza, where the atmosphere was entirely electric. The media embargo had finally been lifted, and the department's public information officer was currently at the podium in the briefing room downstairs, announcing to a packed gallery of international journalists that the 1989 Upper West Side mystery had been shattered. The phone lines were jammed. The televisions hanging from the precinct walls were displaying live aerial shots of the Bay Ridge home, and the name Vincent Moretti was already flashing across the bottom of every news screen in the country as the prime suspect in a cold case that had defined a generation of New York crime. But Lynn didn't stop to watch the spectacle. She walked straight to her desk, picked up the secure landline, and dialed the long-distance number for the retirement community in Arizona. When Marcus Vance answered the phone this time, the background noise of his oxygen concentrator seemed less oppressive, replaced by an absolute, quiet stillness. "We have the confession, Marcus," Lynn said, allowing a faint, weary smile to finally touch her face. "He gave us everything. The tunnels, the coal chute, the concrete on 83rd Street. He's booked. The DA is moving for a special grand jury on Monday morning. You can close your box, detective. The ghost is in a cage." On the other end of the line, 2,000 miles away in the desert heat, the old detective didn't shout or celebrate. He simply let out a long, slow breath that sounded like water hitting a hot stone. "Thank you, kid," Vance whispered, his voice trembling with a relief that was too deep for words. "Tell her family. Tell them she can finally come home." The line went dead, and as Lynn hung up the receiver, she looked down at the old black-and-white photo of the victim sitting on her desk, the smiling eyes of the young woman from 1989 looking out into a world that had finally, through the relentless march of science and human will, refused to let her story be forgotten in the dark. The echoes of Vincent Moretti's voice seemed to cling to the walls of the precinct long after his physical presence had been removed. For Detective Sarah Lynn, the transition from the heavy, concentrated reality of the interrogation room to the chaotic, white-hot frenzy of the main bullpen was like stepping from a soundproof chamber directly into a roaring engine. The media embargo had dissolved completely, and the institutional machinery of the New York Police Department was moving at a speed that threatened to outpace the administrative paperwork required to solidify the arrest. Every television monitor hanging from the ceiling of one police plaza was locked onto the same breaking news broadcast, the red banners flashing across the bottom of the screen. New York cold case shattered, prime suspect arrested at last. Downstairs in the press room, the air was thick with the blinding flash of cameras and the overlapping shouts of reporters demanding granular details from the department's public information officer. The city was waking up to a reality that felt both impossible and inevitable. For 37 years, the disappearance on the Upper West Side had been a dark piece of urban folklore, a ghost story that parents whispered to their adult children when discussing the dangerous, volatile days of late 80s Manhattan. Now, that ghost had been stripped of its mystique, reduced to a 61-year-old grandfather from Bay Ridge who spent his retirement tending to hydrangeas and walking a golden retriever. The shocking duality of Moretti's existence, the terrifying ease with which he had worn the mask of a quiet, law-abiding neighbor, sent a wave of profound discomfort through the entire metropolitan area. Inside the bullpen, Lynn's team was navigating a different kind of pressure. A confession was a massive victory, but in the state of New York, an admission of guilt unsupported by physical evidence was a vulnerable target for a skilled defense attorney. The district attorney's office had already dispatched a team of senior prosecutors to the precinct, their briefcases bursting with historical real estate documents, structural blueprints from 1989, and emergency search warrants that needed to be executed before the sun went down. Moretti had given them the location of the tomb, the disused coal chute beneath the vacant storefront on 83rd Street, but that storefront was no longer a dilapidated relic of a bygone era. It was now a high-end, high-traffic organic grocery boutique in the heart of a thoroughly gentrified neighborhood. The logistics of verifying the confession were a nightmare of modern bureaucracy and engineering. Lynn found herself on the phone with structural engineers, city inspectors, and forensic anthropologists, coordinating an extraction operation that would have to take place beneath the floorboards of an active commercial business. They couldn't simply walk in with sledgehammers and jackhammers. They had to navigate the foundational integrity of a century-old brownstone while the eyes of the entire city watched through the lens of 24-hour news cycles. The owner of the boutique, a bewildered businessman who had purchased the property in the early 2000s, was in a state of sheer shock, his reality upended by the sudden arrival of unmarked police sedans and a legal mandate to vacate the premises for an indeterminate forensic excavation. By 9 p.m., a perimeter had been established around the 83rd Street property. The bright, cheerful storefront, which normally displayed artisanal cheeses and imported wines, was obscured behind heavy black tarpaulins and high-security police barricades. The contrast was macabre, a visual representation of the dark history that New York so often buries beneath the veneer of progress. Floodlights were rolled into the basement, their harsh, white glare illuminating a subterranean world of stone foundations, thick iron pipes, and ancient brickwork that had remained unchanged since the night Moretti dragged his burden through the shadows. Lynn stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, her breath pluming in the damp, freezing air of the cellar. The air smelled of old dirt, wet masonry, and the distinct, metallic tang of rusted iron. Beside her stood Dr. Elena Vance, a forensic anthropologist who had been pulled from her university laboratory to oversee the recovery. The team of city workers, equipped with specialized ground-penetrating radar and heavy-duty concrete saws, moved with a quiet, reverent precision. They weren't looking for a crime scene anymore. They were archaeologists excavating a tragedy, peeling back the layers of the city's physical evolution to expose a truth that had been preserved in stone. The radar equipment began its slow, methodical sweep across the concrete floor, the digital display translating the structural anomalies beneath the surface into ribbons of red and blue pixels. For 2 hours, the only sound in the claustrophobic space was the low hum of the generator and the occasional, murmured directive from the technicians. Then, the monitor flared, a distinct, hollow signature appearing exactly where Moretti had indicated the coal chute had been sealed. The anomaly was undeniable, a disruption in the uniform density of the industrial pore, a physical void that matched the dimensions of a human life cut short. "This is it," Dr. Vance whispered, her eyes fixed on the screen. "The structural density changes right here." He didn't lie about the location. The concrete preserved the seal perfectly. The saw team moved into position, their industrial blades throwing a spray of gray water and fine concrete dust into the air as they began the agonizingly slow process of cutting through 4 inches of reinforced material. The noise was a deafening, mechanical scream that echoed off the stone walls, a sound that felt like the city itself resisting the extraction of its darkest secret. Lynn watched the blades sink deeper into the floor, her mind spinning back to the image of Marcus Vance sitting in his lonely Arizona retirement, holding onto his photocopied files while the rest of the world moved on. She realized that the concrete they were cutting through wasn't just construction material. It was a physical manifestation of 37 years of institutional failure, a barrier that had kept a victim silent while her killer thrived in the light of day. As the blade finished its perimeter cut, a massive block of concrete was carefully hoisted out of the floor using a hydraulic winch, revealing the dark, tightly packed earth of the original coal chute beneath. The saw team stepped back, their job finished, leaving a space to Dr. Vance and her recovery unit, who dropped to their knees with small trowels, soft bristled brushes, and sterile specimen trays. The excavation was an exercise in extreme patience. Every handful of dirt sifted through fine mesh screens, every fragment of material cataloged with surgical care. The air in the basement grew heavier, the silence returning with an oppressive force that seemed to push down on the chests of everyone present. Deep within the dark earth, beneath the debris of 40 years of urban shifting, the trowel of an assistant struck something solid, a fragment of material that was distinct from the surrounding stone and soil. Dr. Vance moved in, her gloved fingers gently brushing away the dark silt to reveal a strip of synthetic fiber, its color faded, but its structure intact. It was the remains of a winter coat, the fabric still holding the shape of the form it had protected on that freezing November night in 1989. The room held its collective breath. Lynn felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cellar. The search was over. The physical corroboration of Vincent Moretti's confession had been unearthed, a silent, devastating witness that had waited in the dark for nearly 4 decades to demand its own reckoning. The narrative was complete. The science had provided the key, the surveillance had provided the target, the interrogation had provided the map, and now, the Earth itself had surrendered the final, undeniable proof that would lock the cell door behind the monster forever. Lynn stepped out of the basement and onto the crowded pavement of the Upper West Side, where the cold night air hit her face like a physical slap. The street was lined with onlookers, residents of the neighborhood who had gathered behind the police tape, their faces pale under the flashing blue lights of the cruisers. They stood in absolute silence, a quiet respect that felt entirely alien to the usually boisterous rhythm of Manhattan. They knew what was happening beneath their feet. They understood that a 37-year-old wrong was finally being righted, that the silence that had haunted their community for a generation was finally being broken by the heavy, deliberate footsteps of justice. As she walked toward her sedan, Lynn looked up at the windows of the brownstones lining the avenue. The lights were on, people standing by their glass, watching the black tarpaulins with a mixture of horror and relief. The city had forgotten for a while. It had hidden the sin beneath high-end grocery stores and luxury developments, but it had ultimately been forced to remember. The cold case was no longer a file, no longer a collection of theories, and no longer a phantom that could elude detection. It was a reality, a verified, unassailable truth that would now move into the halls of the state Supreme Court, where Vincent Moretti would have to look at the evidence of his brutality and answer for the life he had stolen, the family he had destroyed, and the city he had deceived for half his life. The processing of the crime scene beneath the organic boutique on 83rd Street extended long into the following afternoon, transforming the wealthy, bustling corridor of the Upper West Side into a grim theater of forensic recovery. Every bucket of dark, wet silt hoisted from the subterranean coal chute was treated with the reverence of a sacred relic. The forensic anthropology unit worked under the relentless glare of halogen construction lights, their movements small, precise, and entirely silent as they mapped the structural reality of Vincent Moretti's crime. Outside the black tarpaulins, the city continued its relentless, indifferent shuffle, but within the perimeter, time had stopped completely. The air remained thick with the scent of old dirt and ancient concrete dust, a physical manifestation of a truth that had been aggressively choked out of existence 37 years prior. Detective Sarah Lynn remained on the scene until the final container was sealed and loaded into the medical examiner's transport vehicle. Her body ached with a deep, systemic fatigue that no amount of caffeine could penetrate, yet her mind remained wired, ticking through the legal hurdles that still lay ahead. A confession and a recovery were a prosecutor's dream, but the Manhattan District Attorney's Office was already anticipating the strategic moves of the defense. Vincent Moretti's family had retained a high-profile criminal defense firm from downtown, a team of aggressive, media-savvy attorneys who were already pivoting from standard denials to a complex narrative of institutional coercion and psychological fragility. They were going to fight the DNA, they were going to question the legality of the abandonment theory regarding the bakery napkin, and they were going to paint Moretti as a frail, confused old man who had been broken down by a 12-hour interrogation, without legal representation. The administrative fallout began on Monday morning inside the neo-Gothic fortress of the Manhattan Criminal Courts, building on Center Street. The media presence was overwhelming, a literal wall of cameras, microphones, and shouting journalists that blocked the public entrance, forcing the court officers to establish a secure lane for the arrival of the prosecution team. The case had captured the collective imagination of the country, acting as a lightning rod for the ongoing societal debate over the boundaries of privacy in the age of investigative genetic genealogy. Editorial pages were filled with arguments about the ethics of law enforcement searching public DNA databases without explicit user consent, while true crime forums dissected every known detail of Moretti's 3 decades of domestic tranquility in Bay Ridge. Inside the grand jury room, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the performative circus on the streets outside. The room was sterile, air-conditioned, and dominated by 23 ordinary citizens who sat in tiered rows, their expressions a mix of profound gravity and quiet shock as Lynn walked them through the timeline of the investigation. She didn't rely on emotional rhetoric. She let the evidence do the screaming. She displayed the genealogical charts that trace the Moretti bloodline across generations. She presented the data sheets from the state laboratory that showed the undeniable statistical certainty of the DNA match, and she played the high-definition audio recording of Moretti's own voice describing the physical sensation of the violence in the alleyway on that freezing November night in 1989. The presentation of the confession was the moment the room's collective posture shifted. The jurors leaned forward, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in a slow, rhythmic disbelief as the voice of the quiet, respectable grandfather from Brooklyn unspooled the mechanics of a murder with the clinical detachment of a man describing a routine plumbing repair. The contrast between the horrific nature of the admission and the mundane, raspy quality of Moretti's cadence was deeply unsettling, a reminder that the capacity for absolute evil doesn't always wear a dramatic, theatrical mask. It often lives in the ordinary, everyday spaces of our lives, hiding behind the friendly wave of a neighbor or the reliable service of a building superintendent. The grand jury didn't deliberate long. Within 45 minutes of Lynn wrapping up her testimony, the foreman handed down a true bill, indicting Vincent Moretti on charges of murder in the second degree, the highest charge available under the New York Penal Code for a crime committed in 1989, an era before the state had instituted life without parole or resurrected the death penalty. The legal machinery was locked into place, a heavy, unyielding track that would lead directly to a public trial in the New York Supreme Court, a trial that promised to be one of the most significant, high-stakes forensic confrontations in the city's modern history. While the legal battle was taking shape in the courts, the emotional landscape of the community was undergoing a rapid, painful transformation. In Bay Ridge, the Moretti home on the tree-lined street had become a fortress under siege. The lawn where Vincent had meticulously trimmed the hedges was trampled by news crews, and the front porch where his wife had screamed in terror during his arrest was now dark, the curtains drawn tight against the relentless scrutiny of the world. The family's isolation was total. They were trapped in a unique, agonizing purgatory, forced to reconcile the loving, dependable man who had anchored their lives for 30 years with the monstrous reality of the predator exposed by the state laboratory. The neighbors who had once shared barbecues and borrowing tools now looked at the house with a cold, suspicious detachment, wondering how they could have lived so close to such a profound darkness without ever sensing its presence. On the Upper West Side, the boutique on 83th Street remained closed, its windows covered in heavy paper, a silent monument to the tragedy that had been unearthed beneath its floors. The local community board had already begun discussing the creation of a permanent memorial for the victim, a way of reclaiming the space from the narrative of violence and ensuring that her name would outlast the memory of her killer's deception. The collective guilt of the neighborhood was palpable. People realized that they had walked over her grave for nearly 40 years, buying their groceries, laughing with their children, and living their lives while she lay trapped in the dark beneath their feet, a silent witness to the city's frantic, indifferent march into the future. For Sarah Lynn, the successful indictment provided no sense of personal triumph, only a heavy, lingering fatigue that seemed to settle deep within her bones. She spent her evenings in her office, surrounded by the boxes of historical files, reading through the notes that Marcus Vance had left behind. She felt a profound connection to the old detective, an understanding of the specific, toxic obsession that had consumed his life and fractured his family. She had broken the case. She had found the phantom, but she understood that the victory was a clinical one. It didn't bring the victim back. It didn't heal the decades of sorrow that had hollowed out her family's life, and it didn't change the fact that a monster had enjoyed 37 years of unearned safety while his victim was denied even a proper burial. The true nature of cold case justice was beginning to reveal itself to her. It wasn't a sudden, cinematic explosion of light that dispelled the darkness forever. It was a slow, agonizingly difficult process of scraping away the layers of time, of fighting against the institutional desire to forget, and of holding a mirror up to a society that prefers its tragedies to remain neatly archived and out of sight. The case of 1989 was a victory of science and human will over the collective amnesia of New York, but it was a victory that carried a heavy, permanent cost, leaving everyone who touched it changed, hardened, and deeply aware of the fragile, tenuous nature of the security we take for granted every single day. As the weeks began to drift towards spring, the weather in the city turned, the freezing winter rain giving way to a pale, crisp sunlight that caught the tops of the brownstones along West 84th Street. The news cycles were beginning to shift, their focus drawn away by newer crimes, newer political scandals, and the frantic, unending noise of the modern world. The name Vincent Moretti was moving from the front-page headlines into the interior sections of the legal journals, a transition that marked the end of the public sensation and the beginning of the quiet, grinding preparation for the trial. The battle lines were drawn, the evidence was secured, and the ghost of 1989 was firmly behind bars, waiting for the final, definitive reckoning that would decide whether his decades of silence would end in the permanent darkness of a state penitentiary. Lynn stood by her window, watching the traffic crawl down Broadway, the sirens of a distant squad car echoing off the glass. She knew the work wasn't done. The trial would be a marathon of technical cross-examinations and emotional testimony that would test the resolve of her team all over again. But as she looked down at her desk, at the empty space where the massive, dusty box of the 1989 file had sat for so many years, she felt a quiet, immovable sense of peace. The file was gone. The numbers were verified, and the truth had finally achieved enough gravity to pull the entire house of cards down. The city had tried to forget. It had tried to bury the sin beneath concrete and commerce, but in the end, it had been forced to listen to the silent witness that had waited in the dark for 37 years to demand its own justice. The pale spring light filtering through the high windows of the Manhattan Supreme Court on Center Street did nothing to soften the austere, institutional gravity of the courtroom. The date for the pre-trial evidentiary hearings had been set for early May, a season when the city usually shook off the gray stagnation of winter, but inside the packed gallery, The atmosphere remained locked in the freezing, claustrophobic reality of November 1989. The defense had launched a massive, multi-pronged legal offensive aimed directly at the foundation of the prosecution's forensic architecture. They weren't just contesting the facts, they were putting the future of modern criminal investigation itself on trial, attempting to turn the state's technological breakthrough into a narrative of dystopian government overreach and constitutional violation. Vincent Moretti sat at the defense table, flanked by 3 high-priced corporate defense attorneys whose sharp, tailored suits contrasted sharply with his own faded, institutional jumpsuit. He looked older than he had during his arrest in Bay Ridge, his silver hair unkempt, his shoulders permanently curved inward as if he were trying to minimize his physical footprint in a room that was entirely hostile to his presence. He no longer looked like the formidable, capable superintendent who had mastered the hidden underbelly of Manhattan's real estate. He looked like a relic, a fragile, bewildered senior citizen being swept away by a bureaucratic storm he couldn't comprehend. This presentation was entirely deliberate, a calculated piece of theatrical staging by his legal team designed to evoke a subconscious sympathy from the onlookers and the press corps filling the rows behind him. The primary battleground for the week was the admissibility of the genetic genealogy data and the specific methodology Detective Sarah Lynn had used to secure the bakery napkin. The lead defense counsel, a sharp, combative litigator named Richard Sterling, stood at the podium, his voice booming through the vaulted chamber as he leveled his arguments at the presiding judge. Sterling painted a terrifying picture of a law enforcement apparatus run amok, utilizing private, commercial databases containing the deeply personal health and ancestral information of millions of unsuspecting citizens to hunt down an elderly man based on an unverified, 40-year-old trace of DNA. What we are witnessing here, Your Honor, is a flagrant, unconstitutional fishing expedition, Sterling argued, his hand slamming down onto the wood of the podium for emphasis. The NYPD didn't have probable cause when they uploaded that degraded, ancient sample into a public ancestry network. They didn't have a warrant when they stalked my client through the streets of Brooklyn, waiting for him to discard a piece of trash like a vulture waiting for carrion. If we allow this evidence to stand, if we legitimize this warrantless seizure of a citizen's biological identity from a public espresso cup, we are declaring that privacy in this state is dead. We are giving the state the right to ownership over our very genetic code, anywhere, anytime, without judicial oversight. Lynn sat in the front row of the prosecution section, her face a mask of absolute stillness as she listened to the defense attempt to dismantle her life's work. She had expected this line of attack. It was the standard playbook for high-profile forensic cases in the digital age. She knew that Sterling wasn't just talking to the judge. He was talking to the appellate courts, laying the groundwork for a protracted legal battle that could stretch on for years even if a conviction was secured. The pressure in the room was a physical weight, a slow, crushing pressure that tested the endurance of everyone involved in the prosecution's team. They knew that a single misstep by the judge, a single ruling that restricted the use of the DNA data, could instantly cause the entire case to collapse like a house of cards. When the assistant district attorney, a seasoned, unyielding prosecutor named Catherine Blake, stood up to respond, the energy in the courtroom shifted from defensive positioning to a sharp, clinical counteroffensive. Blake didn't engage in emotional rhetoric or philosophical debates about the future of digital privacy. She anchored her arguments in the established, unshakable principles of New York State constitutional law. She pulled out a stack of legal precedents, her voice clear, rhythmic, and entirely devoid of hesitation as she addressed the bench. Your Honor, the defense is attempting to create a smokescreen of constitutional crisis where none exists, Blake stated, her eyes locking with the judge's. The law regarding abandoned property is clear, consistent, and has been upheld by the highest courts in this country for decades. When Vincent Moretti dropped that napkin into a public ceramic cup and walked out of that bakery onto a public sidewalk, he relinquished any reasonable expectation of privacy regarding that item. He didn't want the napkin, he threw it away. Law enforcement did not breach his home, they did not intercept his mail, and they did not force him to provide a sample. They collected what he discarded in a public space, an action that is entirely legal, entirely standardized, and entirely necessary when pursuing a predator who has successfully used the passage of time to evade the consequences of a horrific crime. Blake then pivoted to the use of the genealogical databases, her argument sharpening into a devastating defense of the victim's rights. The defense speaks of privacy violations, but let us remember the absolute, violent violation that occurred in November 1989. The unknown male DNA profile recovered from the victim's fingernails did not belong to a private database. It belonged to a crime scene. It was a piece of evidence left behind during a murder. Utilizing public genealogical networks to identify the familial line of that unknown profile is no different than using a phone book, a public registry, or a tax database to trace a suspect's identity. It is a modern, scientific extension of classic, ground-level police work, and to restrict its use would be to declare that a killer who manages to stay hidden long enough can use the advancement of society as a shield against his own exposure. The legal debate lasted for 3 agonizing days, a marathon of technical testimonies from geneticists, privacy experts, and the surveillance team who had executed the bakery operation in Bay Ridge. Lynn was called to the stand, forced to endure hours of aggressive cross-examination from Sterling, who attempted to rattle her, to expose a personal bias or a procedural flaw that could compromise the integrity of the investigation. But Lynn held her ground, her responses short, precise, and entirely transparent. She didn't offer opinions. She spoke in dates, times, lab protocols, and forensic certainties, her professional demeanor reflecting the objective, unyielding nature of the science that had brought them to this room. On the final afternoon of the hearings, the judge took his place at the bench to deliver his rulings on the defense's motions to suppress. The courtroom was so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a rhythmic hammer hitting metal. The judge, a veteran jurist known for his meticulous adherence to statutory law, looked down over his glasses at the assembly, his expression unreadable. He began reading his decision, a detailed, 30-page document that systematically addressed every argument Sterling had raised over the previous days. As the judge reached the conclusion of his statement, Lynn felt her chest tighten, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that felt deafening. The court finds that the collection of the discarded napkin from the public establishment did not constitute an illegal search or seizure under the Fourth Amendment, the judge declared, his voice echoing off the wood panels. Furthermore, the utilization of investigative genetic genealogy as an investigative lead is consistent with established law enforcement practices regarding public data analysis. The defense's motion to suppress the DNA evidence and the subsequent confession is denied. The evidence will stand. The trial will proceed as scheduled. A collective, muffled gasp rose from the gallery, a sound of immense, overwhelming relief from the prosecution's section and a sudden, tense rustle of paper from the defense table. Sterling sat down heavily, his jaw set in a hard, angry line, while Moretti simply closed his eyes, his head dropping even lower toward his chest as the reality of his position became completely unavoidable. The last major barrier between the ghost of 1989 and a definitive conviction had been dismantled. The legal track was clear, and the full weight of the state's forensic case was about to be unleashed in open court. Lynn stepped out of the courthouse onto the wide steps of Foley Square, the bright afternoon sun blinding her for a moment after the dim interior of the courtroom. The news vans were already broadcasting live updates, the reporters shouting into their microphones as the details of the judge's ruling filtered out to the public. The case was moving toward its final climax, a high-stakes public trial that would force the city to look back into the mirror of 1989 and confront the reality of a tragedy that had been buried for too long. But as Lynn looked out over the bustling plaza, she knew the victory was only partial. The motions had been won, the evidence was safe, but the true test of endurance was still to come, a trial where the story of a stolen life would finally be told in its entirety, and where Vincent Moretti would finally be forced to look at the family he had destroyed and answer for the darkness he had carried in his heart for half his life. The transition from the procedural abstractions of the evidentiary hearings to the raw, visceral reality of the trial itself felt like a violent shift in the atmospheric pressure of the Manhattan Supreme Court. By the morning of the opening statements, The heat of early June had ascended upon Foley Square, thick and oppressive, forcing the crowds of journalists, legal analysts, and curious onlookers to jam the marble corridors of the courthouse in a frantic bid for entry. The case had evolved beyond a localized crime story. It was now a cultural touchstone, a historical reckoning that forced New York to look back at the jagged, bleeding wounds of its own past. Inside courtroom 424, the air was chilled to an almost unnatural degree by the building's ancient ventilation system, creating a stark, clinical environment that smelled of floor wax, old wood, and the distinct, sharp scent of collective anxiety. The gallery was packed to capacity, every wooden bench filled with a silent, hyper-vigilant audience. In the front row of the prosecution's side sat the remnants of the victim's family. Older now, their faces etched with the deep, permanent lines of a sorrow that had been carried across 2 centuries. Opposite them, on the defense side, sat Vincent Moretti's wife and daughter, their expressions frozen in a state of profound, shell-shocked isolation, caught in the horrific crossfire between the man they thought they knew and the monster the state was about to expose. Detective Sarah Lynn took her seat at the prosecution's table beside Assistant District Attorney Catherine Blake. On the desk between them sat the physical manifestation of the trial's gravity, 3 large, black presentation binders containing the forensic diagrams, the high-resolution DNA sequences, and the structural maps of the Upper West Side drainage and maintenance tunnels. This was no longer an investigation. It was an execution of a legal strategy designed to leave the defense with absolutely no room to maneuver, no exit pathways, and no narrative shelter. When the judge called the court to order, the silence that descended upon the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating stillness that made the rustle of the court stenographer's machine sound like a series of sharp snaps. Blake rose from her chair, adjusted her jacket, and walked slowly toward the jury box. The 12 men and women of the jury, a diverse cross-section of modern New Yorkers ranging from college students to retired transit workers, fixed their eyes on her, their faces reflecting the immense responsibility that had been placed on their shoulders. Blake did not start with the science. She started with the humanity that had been stolen on that freezing November night in 1989. "May it please the court, counsel, members of the jury," Blake began, her voice carrying a clear, melodic cadence that resonated off the high-plastered ceilings. 37 years ago, a young woman walked down the stairs of her apartment building on West 84th Street. She was 23 years old, an aspiring writer, a daughter, a sister, a person whose entire future was stretching out before her like an open road. She went out into the autumn rain to perform a mundane, ordinary task, to discard a bundle of recycling in the service alleyway. She expected to return to her apartment within 3 minutes. She expected to finish the book sitting open on her nightstand. She expected to live her life. Blake paused, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the jurors, her tone dropping into a darker, more deliberate register. But she never made it back up those stairs. Because waiting in the deep shadows of that alleyway was a force of sudden, unprovoked, and absolute violence. A force that wore the face of the 24-year-old assistant superintendent of the neighboring building. A force named Vincent Moretti. At the defense table, Moretti did not move, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the wooden grain of the desk. He had been dressed by his legal team in a soft gray cardigan and a pressed white shirt, a costume designed to maximize his appearance as a harmless, frail grandfather. But against the sharp, clinical trajectory of Blake's words, the disguise felt pathetically thin, a cheap paper mask melting away under a blowtorch. For 37 years, Blake continued, walking directly to the center of the well, her hand rising to point toward the defendant, Vincent Moretti lived a life that was stolen from another. He moved across the river to Brooklyn. He raised children. He celebrated holidays. He watched the sun rise over this city thousands of times, all while holding a secret in his chest that would have broken an ordinary man's sanity. He relied on the vastness of New York to hide him. He relied on the fact that the passage of time would erode the memories of witnesses and turn the physical evidence to dust. He believed that because he had buried his victim beneath tons of industrial concrete in a disused coal chute on 83rd Street, he had successfully buried the truth forever. She leaned against the railing of the jury box, her voice dropping to a harsh, penetrating whisper. But what Vincent Moretti did not realize is that the truth has a physical weight. It leaves a molecular signature. And in 1989, as his victim fought for her life in that dark corridor, she scratched his hands. She tore at his skin. And in that desperate, final struggle, she took a piece of his identity and locked it away beneath her own fingernails. For nearly 4 decades, that microscopic fragment of his blood and his skin sat in an evidence vault, silent, patient, and waiting for the world to develop the tools necessary to make it speak. Today, through the miracle of modern forensic science, that voice is going to be heard in this courtroom. And it will demand the one thing Vincent Moretti denied his victim: justice. The opening statement was a devastating, emotional blueprint that set the tone for the entire first week of the trial. When the defense counsel, Richard Sterling, stood up to deliver his opening, he was already operating from a position of severe containment. He couldn't deny the existence of the DNA, and he couldn't deny the location of the recovery. The judge's pretrial rulings had stripped him of those options. Instead, he attempted to pivot to a strategy of profound mitigation, trying to introduce a sliver of doubt regarding the intent and the psychological state of his client in 1989. "Members of the jury," Sterling said, his voice carrying the booming, theatrical warmth of a classic trial lawyer, "the prosecution has painted a picture of a monster, a cold-blooded phantom who calculated a horrific crime. But the reality you will see over the next few weeks is far more complicated, far more tragic, and far more human than the clinical data on a laboratory spreadsheet." In 1989, Vincent Moretti was a young man from a fractured home, working 80 hours a week in the isolated underbelly of the city, suffering from undiagnosed panic disorders and severe psychological strain. What happened in that alleyway was not a premeditated act of malice. It was a sudden, chaotic, and terrifying panic-induced tragedy, a momentary flash of confusion that went horribly, tragically wrong in the dark. Sterling walked to the defense table, placing his hand lightly on Moretti's bowed shoulder. "The man you see sitting before you today is not the 24-year-old kid who panicked in 1989. This is a man who has spent 37 years living a life of absolute penance, a man who has been a devoted husband, a loving father, and a peaceful neighbor. The state wants to destroy a family in 2026 to settle a debt from 1989, using technology that borders on science fiction to pull an old man into a cage. We ask you not to look at this case through the cold, unfeeling lens of a computer database, but through the lens of human frailty, human time, and the possibility of a life redeemed through decades of quiet, peaceful existence." The presentation of the state's case began the following morning, moving with the heavy, unassailable momentum of an industrial press. Blake did not rush to the DNA. She built the foundation of the crime scene first, establishing the physical geography of the Upper West Side blocks with a precision that turned Courtroom 424 into a virtual time machine. The first witness called to the stand was the retired line surveyor who had mapped the subterranean utility corridors of West 84th Street in the late 80s. Using historical blueprints projected onto a massive screen above the witness stand, he demonstrated how the basement of Moretti's building connected directly to the disused coal chutes that ran beneath the adjacent properties, a hidden, subterranean labyrinth that allowed someone with the right keys to move a large mass from one block to another without ever breaking the surface of the street. The next witness was the business owner who currently operated the organic grocery boutique on 83rd Street. He stood on the stand, his voice shaking slightly as he described the arrival of Detective Lynn's forensic team in February, the destruction of his basement floor, and the excavation of the sealed concrete block. His testimony provided the bridge between the historical narrative and the modern physical reality, forcing the jury to confront the horrifying fact that the crime had remained anchored beneath their feet, integrated into the very commercial fabric of the city they inhabited. But the true emotional climax of the week arrived on Thursday morning, when the prosecution introduced the audio recording of Vincent Moretti's confession. The courtroom lights were dimmed, the large monitors displaying only a static image of the interrogation room's metal table. Lynn sat perfectly still as the low, raspy cadence of Moretti's voice filled the silent chamber. The sound was pristine, every wet intake of breath, every rattle of the handcuff chains against the steel, and every cracking, pathetic note of his admission amplified through the state-of-the-art sound system. The jury sat in a state of absolute immobility, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of the monitors, their eyes fixed on the audio wave display that danced across the screens in rhythmic, jagged pulses. On the tape, Moretti described the sensation of his hands around the victim's throat, his words dropping into a chilling, matter-of-fact monotone that sent a physical shiver through the gallery. I just wanted her to stop screaming. I didn't mean to do it, but the noise wouldn't stop. The raw, unvarnished brutality of the admission, spoken by the very man who sat just 20 feet away in a soft gray cardigan, created a psychological dissonance that completely destroyed the defense's narrative of a harmless, frail old man. The jurors looked from the monitors to Moretti, their expressions shifting from objective analysis to a profound, collective revulsion. Beside Lynn, the victim's family sat with their heads bowed, the mother's shoulders shaking with a quiet, agonizing grief as she was forced to listen to the specific, mechanical details of her daughter's final moments of life. It was a secondary execution, a public unspooling of a private nightmare that had been kept hidden for 37 years, but it was an essential piece of the legal architecture, a confrontation with the truth that could not be bypassed if a definitive verdict was to be achieved. When the tape finally stopped, the silence that followed was heavier than any sound that had preceded it. The prosecution team allowed that silence to hang over the courtroom for a long, agonizing minute, letting the weight of the confession settle into the marrow of the jury's consciousness before the judge finally called for the noon recess. Lynn stood up, her uniform damp with sweat, her mind turning over the upcoming week of testimony when the forensic geneticists would take the stand to close the scientific loop. The trial was moving precisely along the track she had laid out, a clinical, unstoppable march toward a reckoning that New York had delayed for too long, a reckoning that would finally, through the power of science and human endurance, ensure that the ghost of 1989 would have the final, unassailable word.